Hello everyone, and welcome to the CSS Level 1 section of the course. We've now completed HTML, both sections, and it's time to move on to learning about CSS. And the CSS will have two sections to it, Level 1 and Level 2. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and CSS really describes how HTML elements are displayed on the page. And we're just going to take this lecture to describe what CSS is and show you some examples of its true power. So styling can affect many things, such as color, font, size, borders, and many more properties of HTML. So far, we've only been able to create basic HTML documents. While they may have some content and a little bit of functionality, they've basically all looked the same. And when you're actually on the web, you want things to look nice. And usually you define styling outside of the HTML file. You create a separate CSS file and then link that to the HTML file. We're going to show later on some examples that you can actually define styling within the HTML document itself, but it's a much more common and better practice to separate your styling into a CSS file and then link it to the HTML file in the head of that HTML file document. And that's where we're going to be discussing that metadata. Okay, let's show a quick example of just how powerful CSS can be by exploring the same HTML code but with different CSS linked to it. I'm going to go to this link right here. You can find it just by Googling W3 Schools CSS. And there's actually lots of websites that show similar examples of this. So you can just Google search CSS demos and you'll find lots of websites like this. I'm going to open my browser and jump to this link. Okay, here I am at my browser, and I've come to the w3schools.com website that has CSS introduction. And you'll notice here on the left-hand panel is actually a really nice reference to a bunch of CSS topics, such as outlines, text, fonts, etc. We're going to be covering a lot of these, but throughout the course, if you feel like you need more of a reference, you can just visit w3schools.com and hit on CSS. Another website I want to mention that I like probably a little better than W3 Schools is the Mozilla Developer Network. They also have a ton of information about Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS. They have a tutorials, introduction, reference, and as you become more of a developer, as you've already learned the tools, you'll probably be using the reference more than the tutorials and introduction sections. So just keep that in mind. These are two really great links for you to check out in case you want to dive deeper into some of the stuff we talk about during this course. But I just want to show you the CSS introduction page, which actually has kind of a fun demo, so you can see one HTML page with multiple styles. And you'll notice if you scroll down here, it says, "Welcome to my home page." And this is HTML that's linked to CSS. And you'll notice we see that we have like this green header bar, we have some different fonts, etc., a little sidebar, but we also have these links to different style sheets. And if I click on one of these links to style sheet number 2, for instance, you'll notice the website completely changes. But the fun fact to know here is that this is actually the exact same HTML code. The only thing that's changing is the CSS file that it's linked to. So all the changes you see here when you hit on these style sheets is just pure CSS. None of the HTML is changing, none of the content is changing. Just the CSS is changing itself. And now you can really see, let me click on style sheet 4 here, just how powerful CSS is. It can make your website look completely different using the same content. And if we click here on no style sheet, this is what we've been working with, just pure HTML. So it's the same page, just different style sheets. So this is no style sheet, and you can see as we play around with these, you can get a vastly different looking website with all these style sheets. And after these two CSS Level 1 and Level 2 sections, we're going to be learning about Bootstrap, which helps streamline a lot of this process and take care of a lot of the work for you. But before we hit Bootstrap, we really should understand CSS itself. That way, if we ever need to customize anything, we can do that before we just jump straight into Bootstrap. Okay, so let's continue on and start learning about the basics of CSS. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Part 1 of CSS Level 1. I just wanted to quickly point out, in this section of the course, the notes are divided up into parts 1 through 5, and then we have a final Level 1 assessment. Each part consists of an HTML file and a CSS file. So for example, you may have something like part1.html and then part1_master.css. So those two files are meant to go together and be linked together. And you can refer to the contents of the CSS Level 1 folder for more information. Okay, let's get started with part 1, where we begin to discuss the very basics of CSS and how we can link it to an HTML file. Going to jump to the Atom text editor to get started. Alright, so here I have my editor open as well as my browser. I've created a new folder called CSS Level 1, and I have two files in it, part1.html and part1_master.css. And we'll be typing and coding these out. If you want the completed versions, just check the CSS Level 1 folder from the download. Alright, moving along, a quick note. It's unusual to have a digit or a number inside the name of a CSS or HTML file. I'm just leaving them there so it's clear which ones match up with the course notes and parts. But usually you wouldn't actually have a digit or number inside the name of an HTML or CSS file. So I just wanted to quickly note that. Let's start off by making a very basic HTML page, and then we'll show how we can link stuff in the CSS file to it. So right now I have part1.html open. I'll hit HTML, and I'm going to collapse the directory with just Control or Command / there. And we'll just make this called CSS Basics in the title. We'll save that. And then in the body, I'm going to have a heading. And this heading is just going to say, this is the heading. And we'll have a paragraph as well in the body. And it's going to just say, let's see a list. And then let's just create an ordered list, OL, where each item has a list item tag, LI. We'll have item 1, and let's make 2 more items in this list. Item 2, LI, hit enter there, and then item 3. Okay, let's save that, refresh our browser over here. Looks good. I can zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. Okay, so I have this is the heading, let's see a list, item 1, item 2, item 3, and let's on the bottom say a heading 4, this is heading 4. Save that, refresh, and now we see at the bottom we have heading 4. Perfect. Now we want to learn how we can actually connect styles to this HTML document. And that is where the head portion of the HTML document comes into play. What we need to do is use a special keyword tag called link. And you'll see as I begin to type it, I can hit enter, and I get a link here. And by default, it says the relationship of this link is a style sheet, and then we have href, which is going to be the actual path to this .css file. And in our case, it's called part1_master.css. And we can just use part1_master.css. If it was located somewhere else on my computer, I'd have to type in the whole file path or make a reference to the whole file path. But these two files are in the same directory, so I can just write part1_master.css. And I also want to make sure that I specify that it's a style sheet. And then I click Save here, and if I refresh, I won't notice anything different, but now my HTML document is linked to my style sheet. So let's jump to the style sheet, this .css, and get started. First, let's show you the basics. If I want to make a comment, it's just a /*, and then anything you type in between 2 of those, so then another */ is a comment. And just like we did with HTML, I can type some text, so we'll say some text, and then I can do Control // and it automatically makes that into a comment, so you can save yourself some time there. And that also works for multi-lines. So if I have some text on multiple lines, I can highlight all of this, do Control or Command // and it will automatically make that all into a comment. And it's always good to comment your code if you come back to it a later time. Now let's discuss the general form of CSS. The general form looks something like this. You have some sort of selected tag, then curly braces. Inside these curly braces, you're going to have some property, a colon, and then some value for that property, and a semicolon. So that's going to be the very basic format for a CSS file. I'm going to comment that out and actually show you an example of one. So let's think of a selected tag. If I look back to my HTML file, I know that I have h1 as a possible tag. So let's grab that tag by typing in h1. I put in curly brackets, and I can zoom in here a little bit so it's a little clearer. And then I want a property of h1. And one of the first properties we're going to be working with is the color property. And you can see here that as I begin to type stuff in the CSS file, Atom Text Editor is actually trying to help me out. Like, oh, do you want color? Do you want columns, column count, etc.? So we just want color, so I can actually hit enter there, and it will begin helping me out here with this. So I want color, and then I can state the actual color I want. In this case, I want the color to be blue, and then a semicolon. And you notice what happened as I was typing the color itself, for instance purple, it doesn't turn yellow, that syntax highlighting, until it's a color that works. Now, there are actually a lot of colors that CSS already knows just by their name, things such as basic colors like red, green, black, orange, purple, etc. Later on, we're going to learn how to actually pass in color codes, but for right now, we're going to keep things really simple and just make this blue. So let's save this and see what happens when we refresh our page. And now you notice that this is the heading. Anything with the h1 tag now has the color blue. And that's the very basic idea of how CSS works. So you just have whatever tag you want to affect in the HTML, the property of that HTML, and then what you want to change that property to. There are a ton of properties you can edit using CSS connected to your HTML file. One of the most basic ones that we've covered already is color, and we're going to show you right now in this lecture various ways to change the color using not just keywords but also codes such as an RGB code, an RGBA code, and a hex code. And we'll discuss what those are in just a little bit. But don't worry too much right now about having to memorize all the various properties that are available to you. as we go through CSS Level 1 and CSS Level 2, you're going to begin to naturally understand what properties you want to affect using CSS. For this lecture, all I want you to get out of it is the general format of CSS, which is the tag name, the curly braces, and then the property and what you want the property value to be, and how to link CSS to the HTML file and the different ways to change color. So we've already learned how to link the HTML file. Remember, that was just this link tag. We've already learned the basic method of CSS, which is this tag, curly braces, and then property value. So let's continue to explore the different ways we can affect color. So far we learned that there are certain keywords, very common colors are available for us. So if I make this red, save this, refresh on my page, now this is the heading is red. So let's explore some more of this. I'm going to put another tag in, li, so that's going to affect all elements with the tag li. Remember, that's item 1, item 2, and item 3. Let's call color, and let's make these green. Save it, refresh over here, and now I can see that item 1, item 2, and item 3 are green. But there are other ways to do colors. You don't just have to use color names, because maybe you want your own custom color, a certain shade of blue, a certain shade of red, etc. You can do RGB codes. Let's explore a little bit more about what RGB codes look like. If I take my browser and expand it, and I go to Google, then here in Google, I can search for RGB, hit enter, and I get this RGB color model. And then I can also do RGB picker, and notice that some of the top links are colorpicker.com, W3 schools, RGB color codes charts. Any of these will work just fine. We can click on colorpicker.com. Basically here we have what's known as a color picker. So if I zoom in a bit, you may be familiar with something that looks like this. Remember, we actually saw our own color picker back when we were working with HTML. But here you just select whatever color you want based off what looks good to you visually, and you can get the actual RGB code. And you can also get hex codes, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But if you notice, we go back to Google and just search for color picker, then Google itself will actually show you the values here. So I like using Google's own color picker, so just Google searching for color picker actually brings RGB and this hex code for you, which we're going to discuss in just a little bit. But let's say I wanted a specific shade of green. I saw the basic green we had, but let's say I want kind of a more forest green, a little darker. So I come down here, I pick the color I like, and I note these color numbers right here. This basically is a representation of how much red is in the color, how much green is in the color, and how much blue is in the color. And that's why it's called RGB. So I can come back here, and in this RGB, I will input those numbers. So it was 8, jumping back here, 84, and 1. So 8, 84, and 1. And notice once it's complete, everything is now the same teal color as far as syntax highlighting. So I will save this, come back here, and refresh. And it might not be too noticeable on your screen, but I can see that this is a nice darker green. And just to make it really obvious, we'll come and choose a brighter color. So let's go from dark green to maybe some bright orange. So come back to color picker, play around with this, maybe choose this really bright orange over here. That's 255970. I'll copy that, paste it in here. 255 red, 97 green, 0 blue. I will save my CSS file to save those changes, refresh, and now I can see the list items have definitely changed. Item 1, item 2, item 3. All right, let's explore 2 more methods of changing color. So I will grab this, let's see a list, which is, remember, just a paragraph. So I say P, curly braces, call the color property, and now I want to show you how to use hex codes. And hex codes are basically just another way of displaying the color in an actual code value. So let's make it into kind of a nice blue. Hopefully these are showing up well on your screen. So I like this shade of blue. I copy and paste this hex code and make sure it has this hashtag symbol in front of it. Paste it in here, and then a semicolon to save this. And then I will come back here to CSS Basics, refresh, and now I see that the paragraph, or anything with a paragraph tag, has been changed to have a blue color, that specific blue that I chose. So that's just another way of coding out a color. You have RGB, red, green, blue, and you also have hex codes. Finally, I want to show you one last way, and we'll do it for heading 4. And it's really similar to RGB, except it's RGBA. And the difference between RGB, which is red, green, blue, and RGBA, which looks like this color, RGBA, and then it's going to have 4 inputs, is that RGB is just red, green, blue. RGBA is red, green, blue, and a term called alpha. And if you've done any sort of data visualization before, you'll be familiar with alpha, where the alpha parameter is a number between 0 and 1, where 0 stands for fully transparent and 1 stands for fully opaque. So you can think of that second or that last A value, that alpha value, as just clarifying how dark or how transparent this color is. So let's come back up here, choose these values, these same values, and then input, let's say 0.5 for our color. So we'll save that, come back to heading 4, refresh. So we can see here at 0.5, the orange is a little lighter. If I go all the way to 1, and I save this, refresh here, then I can see that I have basically the darkest possible version of this RGB. It's fully opaque, and that should match up with the normal RGB. So RGBA, with A or alpha being 1, is the exact same thing as RGB. And now if I make this 0 and save, refresh, then I can see that it's fully transparent. So when I highlight it, I can see it, but with 0, it's fully transparent. So again, RGBA, really similar to RGB, except A, this last term, just defines how transparent it is, with 0 being fully transparent and 1 being fully opaque. Okay, so that's it as far as this part 1. What we've learned so far is how to connect CSS to HTML, the general format for a CSS selected tag property value mechanism, and then how we can affect colors. Throughout the course, probably the most common color method we're going to be using are hex codes, and that's probably what you see most commonly these days. You also see RGB quite a lot, RGBA. It's not very common unless you're doing a very quick website to just directly call a letter name colors like red, purple, green, etc. But for really quick jobs, you may want to do that just because it's much easier, but usually you see hex codes. Okay, thanks everyone, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of CSS Level 1. In part 2, we're going to begin to discuss backgrounds and borders. We will also show you how to utilize the div and span tags that we mentioned during the HTML sections of the course, but weren't actually able to really use. Let's get started by jumping to the editor and our CSS files. Alright, so here I have my browser open as well as my editor. I have an HTML file, I've called it part2.html, and I've used this link with the style sheet to reference another CSS file called part2_master.css. And you can really name these whatever you want, just make sure that your link is correct. To get started, let's create a little bit of content in this HTML file. I'm going to say, this is a paragraph, and we'll also mention it's outside any divs. So outside any div container. And then I'm actually going to create a div. And a div allows us to essentially create a container. And you'll notice that as I autocomplete this, I get this class pop up. Don't worry about that for now. We're going to learn about class in a future lecture in CSS. For now, just leave it as the basic div opening and closing tags. And I'm going to make 3 paragraph tags inside of this. First one will say, I'm inside the div. Second one will say, I'm also inside the div. And then the third one is going to say this, inside div, and then we'll use the span tag that we've learned about, and then we'll say inside span. And save that. Let's refresh, make sure everything's working. And we see here, this is a paragraph outside any div. I'm inside the div, inside the div, inside div, and then inside span in all caps. Perfect. So now we have all the content. It's time to play with our CSS file to see how we can affect that content. And I'm a little zoomed in here, so yours probably won't be as large in your browser as mine is, but this is just so you can view it. First thing I want to discuss is affecting the entire body of the HTML. So you'll notice all our HTML content is inside these 2 body tags. Everything else is just metadata. So all the actual HTML content is within these 2 body tags, which means if I want to affect everything, essentially, in that HTML, I can call the body tag. So that's my selected tag, and then I can affect the property. For instance, one property I can affect is the background. And you'll notice that Atom Text Editor will try to help you out with a bunch of prompts here. Background color, background position, repeat, etc. Let's keep it basic and just do the background color. And I will just type in a color here. Let's type in gray as our background color. Going to save this and refresh this page. And now I notice that the entire background for everything in the body, which is essentially all the HTML content, is gray. Perfect. Now, let's explore the div. And remember, the div allows us to essentially make these containers. So div, I'll specify the background color for the div to be something like blue. Semicolon, save it, and refresh here. And now everything that was inside the div, these 3 lines, including that inside span, are now have a background of blue. And something to also note here, for colors, for very basic colors, it doesn't matter whether you say background-color or if you just say background. Either one of these will work. So if I save this and change this to, let's say, something like red, which is going to be really bright and annoying, so I wouldn't suggest that you do that, but there it is. I'm inside dev, also inside dev, etc. Background essentially works the same way as background color when it comes to just very basic coloring. Now let's explore how to do borders. So borders are going to require 3 elements to it. Basically the border color, the border width, and then the border style. So for instance, if I make a border for the div, and I say the border, let's say the border color is going to be blue. So the border color is blue. If I click refresh here, I'm not going to see anything. And that's because I haven't defined the border width and the border style. So I need to define those 2 first. Otherwise, CSS doesn't really know how thick of a border I want be around this div. So we'll say border width. And notice that we can actually specify left, right, top, image, bottom, etc. We're going to keep things basic for now and just specify the border width. And if I hit enter, Atom Text Editor, always here to help, also says you want a thin border, a medium border, or a thick border. So we'll say thick for now. And then we'll also say border style. And the border style we'll do is something like a, let's just say dotted. So let's save this, refresh. And now you can see I have a dotted blue border around this div. Now you may be also wondering, well, what's the difference between thick and thin? So if I replace this with thin, save that and refresh, then I see, if you can't really see it here, but if you do this on your own computer, you'll see extremely thin pixels here of the border. Usually, however, you don't want thin or thick, you want to specify your own thickness. And you can do that by specifying the pixels. So I can say something like 10 px, and that will tell me that I want the border width to be 10 pixels. So if I refresh this, then I can see 10 pixels here. And later on, we'll also see how to specify pixel widths in relevance or in relationship to other elements. So you don't have to have an absolute pixel. So now let's make this super thick. So I'll make this 100, refresh this, and I can see I have a really super thick, so only 4 were able to show up. Let's make this much thinner, something like 5. Save this, refresh, and here we have at 5 pixels. We can do 2 pixels, save and refresh, and you get the idea. All right, so that was background, background color, and then the 3 elements you need for border: the style, the width, and the color. And it's a lot of fun to play around with the styles, especially since the Atom Text Editor is really going to help you choose styles. So you can also do things such as a double, refresh. You can see this kind of double border. Almost looks like a painting. Okay, so that was how we can affect things inside the div. Now, let's show you how we can affect text color. So if I say something like paragraph, call the color, and make everything inside of this something like green, and that will affect all the paragraphs, regardless of where they are. Let me make this into a clearer color. Let's say something like yellow, and let's make this background blue, and make this border color orange. That way things are hopefully more clear for you to see. All right, so what I've done here is I've changed the colors of the div background and border, but I also said all paragraph elements have the color yellow. And notice that when I say all paragraph elements, it doesn't matter whether they're inside the div or outside the div. When I call something like this, it specifically requests all paragraph elements regardless of where they are. Later on, we'll show you how to select elements that are inside of divs and also a specific element type. So maybe you only want to affect headings inside of a div or heading 4s inside of a specific div. Then lastly, I want to show you the span tag. And the span allows us to grab anything within that span. So remember, it was these 2 words, inside span. So I will call background here and say something like red. And let's give it a color of black. So now if I save this and refresh over here, I can see inside span is now background red, color black. All right, so what have we learned so far? We've learned the body, div, p, and span tags. Hopefully now you realize that you can basically call any HTML tag and start affecting its properties. The properties we learned about so far are the background, border, and color properties. Lastly, I want to show you another case of background where you can actually set the background to be an image. So let me grab an image. You can do this just by going to Google Images and then looking up whatever image you want. So let's say I want a picture of a beach. I can look up this. I click here on this image, then I click View Image, and it takes me to this link right here. So let me copy that full path, and for background, I'm going to say not gray, but I will actually call a special keyword URL and pass in that entire URL. So that's linking the background to this image. So now I will save this, and back under CSS Basics, I will refresh, and we can see here we get the, if I expand this, we get that whole beach image as the background for the body. If we want it, we don't need to have it zoomed in like this. We can specify various properties of this background image. Things, for instance, such as background repeat or background no repeat, etc. So we can actually specify how many times we want it to repeat. In our case, the background image is so large that it's not going to make much of a difference because I'm zoomed in. But if I zoom out here, we can begin to see that I have this background image. I'm zoomed out right now, and I see that entire beach. So if I want the background to repeat multiple times, then under repeat, background repeat, I can say repeat. Save that, refresh this page, and I can see now the background is being repeated. Alright, so far we have these kind of funky, really 90s looking HTML sites. Later on we're going to see how we can make these into much nicer, but right now the point is to really understand how CSS works. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 3 of CSS Level 1. A major part of what we've seen so far has revolved around the idea of CSS selectors, where selectors in general are used to target HTML elements that we want to style. So far, we've only approached the idea of selecting HTML elements by their tag, so grab all paragraph tags or grab all list tags. But what if we only want to select subsets or select a single element? That is where we can use selectors to clarify exactly what elements we want in the HTML. We can use IDs to target single elements, and we can use classes to target groups of elements, and then we can also use a wide variety of combinations of selector tags to target certain combinations of elements, things such as descendants or adjacent siblings, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. So let's jump right in to show how this all works. Alright, so here I have an HTML called part3.html, and it's linked to part3_master.css. And in the body of this HTML, I'm going to add some content. I'll add a heading 3 that says, I'm a h3 heading, and then I'm going to add some divs. And now when it says class, remember it auto-completes class, I'm going to actually add some classes to this. So we'll call this first div class. And we'll put a paragraph in here that says, I'm inside the first div class. That way we can see what's going on when we actually begin to style these. Then I will add another division container, and we'll call this second div. And in a paragraph, we'll write, I'm inside the second div class. And then we'll add a little bit more. I'm going to add a paragraph, and with this paragraph, we're going to add an ID to it. So we'll add an ID, and we're going to set it equal to singled out. And in this paragraph, we'll say IDs must be unique. Then we're going to make another heading 3 that says, here's a list. And you can also just copy and paste this from the part3.html if you don't want to type it all out yourself. And we'll have an unordered list. Li will say something like confirm. You can write whatever really text you want in here. And then Li will say something like feedback, question mark. And inside of these list elements, we're also going to add inputs. So this first input is going to just be a checkbox input. And the second input is going to be a text. So a checkbox, really similar to a radio button that we've seen earlier, except in our case, it's actually just a checkbox that you've probably seen before online. And then another list, we're going to drop an anchor tag here, and we'll give an href to a website. This website will be my website, pyreandata.com, and we'll say Pyrean Data. I know this is a lot of content, so feel free to pause or just copy and paste from the notes, and then we'll put another anchor tag here that has an href of some other website. Let's just say npr.org, or you can put any news website you want here, or really any website. We'll say that's NPR. Alright, lots of stuff here, so let's break it down real quick. Let's refresh this to make sure everything's linked, expand it a bit. Alright, so right now I have this h3 heading, something that's inside the first div class, something that's inside the second div class. Let me make sure I spelled that correctly. Refresh this. And then IDs must be unique. There's our ID. We have here is a list, confirm with a checkbox on it that we can click on and off, feedback with some text input here, then 2 links here, priority data and NPR. All right, we have all of this, so now let's jump to CSS and actually talk about how we can link to this. So notice here I have classes and then my IDs. So if I come to my CSS and I say something like div, and I specify the color of all divs to be red, and then I come back here and I refresh this, no matter where the div is, no matter what class it is, as long as it has the tag div, it's going to be the color red. So first div becomes red, second div becomes red. Normally, however, you don't want to affect every single tag that has div. You want to select subsets. In that case, we can use these classes that we assigned. So I can select first div or second div instead of selecting everything that's inside any div. And that's the key to using classes. Now what you can't do with a class is just say first div and then color something blue. Otherwise, if I refresh this, notice no change occurs. When you're dealing with a class, you tell CSS that it's a class through a dot. So classes always start with a dot or a period. So now if I save this, refresh over here, I can see that I'm inside the first div class has now become blue. And likewise, I can grab the second div and color that red. Refresh this, and I can see now inside the first div class, inside the second div class are their own individual colors. So this is a very common tool to use. And this is where we're getting into the idea of selectors. So for classes, they always start with this dot or this period. Okay, now we noticed that we also had an ID. And for IDs, you want an ID to be unique. It just is attached to a single element, versus classes can be attached to multiple elements. So for an ID, it's usually just a single element. Classes can be across multiple divisions, multiple containers, multiple paragraphs, etc. Classes use a hashtag. So shift number 3, there's a hashtag there, and then we put in the name of the class, which in our case was singled out. And we can see that also the syntax highlighting tells you, oh, you're dealing with a class here. So let me double check that it's singled out. There it is. And let's change this something to color, let's say green. And let's also give it something called a text decoration. So text decoration, I'm just going to kind of throw this in. These are things such as overlines, underlines, or like a strike through, a line through. So we'll give that a line through. Save it. Let's refresh. We can see here, we see IDs must be unique is now the color green, and it also has a line through. So they were kind of just throwing in a little 2-in-1, both how to use IDs and the fact that you can use text decorations as another property. And you can always use the CSS references in the notes for various properties if you're looking for them. Another common thing, actually not common, sorry, is the asterisk. The asterisk is a selector for selecting every element on the page. So if I say color every element, and then let's say black, I save this and refresh, it's going to color everything black, and it's going to override certain things. It won't override IDs, but you can see here that it's overriding these class calls. This asterisk call tries to override as much as it can over all the elements. A quick note though, this is actually very uncommon. You usually don't want to just call everything like this. Maybe if you want something like a background, but it's usually pretty uncommon to just call an asterisk there. Although I do want you to be aware that you can use an asterisk to select all the elements in the HTML. However, they'll be overridden if they have a particular ID. Alright, finally, I want to discuss a few different types of selectors. You can check out the links in the actual CSS file if you're interested in more of these, and I have the link open here in another tab. But basically, here is a CSS selector reference, and you can actually call elements on many types of selectors. So there's a huge list here of the various types of selectors, and I want to show you a few examples of the more common ones. So far we've seen things like class, like dot class, hashtag ID, asterisk to select all the elements, and then certain elements like just calling the element tag. Alright, so let's show an example of one of those CSS selectors known as adjacent siblings, and that has to do with elements that are next to each other. Let's imagine that I wanted to select all unordered list items that are next to an H3, a heading 3. I would do this. I'd say heading 3, and then I use the plus operator. Unordered list, curly braces, and then whatever property I wanted. So let's give them a border, and we can do border, border style, and border thickness all in one line. So instead of saying, like we've done before, border color, and then border width, and then border style, I can actually just call border by itself, pass in a thickness, so let's give it 4 pixels, then give it a style, let's say it's the dotted style, and then give it a color, let's give it purple. And that's kind of a quicker, nicer way to create borders. So we'll save this, refresh our page here, and now I can see that any unordered list that is next to an H3 now has this border. So that's known as adjacent siblings. And you can always reference here on the links in the CSS file for the notes, the various different types of CSS selectors. So in our case, this plus basically says select all unordered list elements that are placed immediately after an H3. Okay, there are 2 more CSS selectors that I want to cover for this lecture, and one of them is known as descendants, and the other one is for attributes. So for descendants, it basically looks like this. If we want to grab all anchor tags that are inside a list, you just put a space between them. So all anchor tags inside of a list, and then we can affect them. So let's give them a color. Let's say something like red, semicolon there, refresh our page, and we can see now that any anchor tag that's inside a list now has the color red. And then the last one I want to show you is how to actually affect attributes. So let's say we want to go further than this and actually grab any anchor tag inside of a list with a particular href, an actual link. Then I can use square brackets for this and say href here equal to www. Let's go with the last one, which was npr.org, or whatever website you happen to put in there. We'll give it a color. Let's just give it the color something like blue. And let's give it a border. So let's practice using that border again. Remember, you just give it a thickness, such as 5 pixels. The style, let's give it the style solid, and then some color. Let's give it orange. Save this, refresh our page, and we can see now we've selected any anchor tag with this particular href inside of a list and change its color and its border. Alright, so that's really all there is for these particular CSS selectors. Throughout the course, the most common ones we're going to be dealing with are really class selectors and ID selectors. While we will show various things such as adjacent siblings or descendants, attributes, etc., these throughout our course are going to be less commonly used just because we won't be really focusing on those type of minute details while we're learning. We will really more focus on classes and IDs. So make sure you really know these 2 types. Dot for classes, hashtag for IDs. Okay, and if you ever want to reference the various other types of CSS selectors, just open up the CSS file and it has links to these CSS reference selector pages. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to part 4 of CSS Level 1. We won't actually be doing any coding for this lecture. Instead, we will just be getting a tour of the Google Chrome Browser Inspector, which is a really useful tool for us to actually explore the HTML, CSS, and even later on JavaScript on a website. So go ahead and open up Google Chrome, and let's start exploring. Okay, so here I am at Google Chrome, and I have the part3.html file from last time, which is linked to the part3 CSS, open up in my browser, and then in another tab I have the Google Home website. What I want you to do is with the part3.html file open, you can right click, and previously we've seen how we can just view page source, and that shows us just the HTML that's linked to this document. But what I want to do now is instead of just viewing the page source, which is just the HTML, I can right click on this and click on inspect. And now, let me zoom in a little bit. I can see that here on this panel, I have the HTML code. So that's what we've seen before, and stuff gets highlighted as I select it. So as I select H3, I can see that H3 over here is highlighted. And you can also see that there's almost like a bit of a border around it. Some parts blue, some parts orange. We're going to be discussing that later on. But what I really want to focus on here is the styles, since we're talking about CSS. So we can bring this tab over, and here I can actually see the styles that I was assigning to that CSS. So second div is a class where the color is red. And what's really cool about this is you can actually click on some of these things and edit them. So if you begin to zoom out so we can see the whole thing, click on color red, and you can actually change this color in real time. So if you want it to be blue, you can see right here on the second div, it's actually changing. So we can make it something extreme, and we can just make it any color of the rainbow we want. Great, and other things we can do is select an element to inspect it. So for instance here on NPR, we can see now that it's an LI, A, and we can see that border and color. So again, we can change the color, or we can even change other properties in real time. So if I want to make this border super thick, you can see that I'm changing it in real time as I type this. Or if I want to make it dotted instead of solid, I can do that as well. All right, so there's two reasons why I want to show you this. One reason is that if you're working on a website, you can immediately just load it up, start inspecting it, and quickly change things on the fly so you can see how things look and change them immediately without having to constantly refresh your website. You can just play around with the colors here live instead of constantly refreshing. But the more useful tool on this is actually exploring other websites. So for example, you come here to this Google homepage, and if you're interested in how something works or what font is going on, maybe you right-click, inspect, and you can click on this little tool, which is select an element in the page to inspect it. So we click here on the Google search button, and now we can see the various styles that have to do with it. So you can see it has a color. We can change that color if we want. So we see here we're changing the font of the actual Google search. Maybe we change to something green or blue, etc. Something to note here is the only thing I'm changing is what I'm seeing in my browser. If I refresh this page, I'm not actually changing any of the files or any of the CSS files. But again, you can play around with this, maybe make the font huge, so Google search, etc. And as we approach JavaScript and learn how to work with the DOM, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will in the future, we'll see how we can actually use JavaScript to grab some of these elements and then affect them. But right now, I just want you to be aware of the Chrome Browser Inspector as a really great tool for you, not just to explore your own websites, but other people's websites as well. Okay, that's really it for this lecture. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture where we'll hop back into CSS and start coding again. Hello everyone, and welcome to part 5 of CSS Level 1. In this lecture, we'll briefly cover a CSS topic known as specificity. Specificity defines the hierarchy of CSS styling, and what type of tags overrule others. We've actually already briefly seen this when we were using the asterisk tag, and we saw how even though we use the asterisk tag in an attempt to cover all the tags in an HTML document, tags that had an ID call on them were able to maintain their styling. We're going to cover the hierarchy of this in this lecture. Let's get started by jumping straight to the Atom text editor. Alright, here I have the Part 5 HTML document open, and I have a heading for specificity, but what I'm going to do is add in an unordered list, and each list item is going to have a particular tag with it. So this first list item is going to belong to a class, and we'll call this class top items. And we'll give it the name, or we'll call it just first. And then the second list is going to say an ID, and that ID will be 2, but it will also belong to the class top items. We'll say it's the second. And then finally, we'll have third, whoops, and then another list item called fourth. So let's save that, refresh over here, zoom in a bit, and we see we have the first, second, third, and fourth item in this list. The first one has only the class, the second one has an ID and a class, and then the last two, third and fourth, are just normal list items. Let's see what happens as we begin to add in styling. Let's say we just style everything that has li to it, and we say, okay, the color of all list items are going to be red. If I refresh this page, all list items become red. But now, let's say I also grab the top items class. So remember, with a class, we have to use that period or dot. And I call color here. And I color it blue. What do we think is going to happen here? Well, if I refresh, I notice now anything with the class top items has become blue. So top items is higher in the hierarchy than a general tag call. And that kind of makes sense. You would want general tag calls to happen after you have a class. And then, further up the hierarchy, on top of a class, is an actual ID. And remember, we do IDs with a hashtag. So right now I have the ID of 2. And I'm going to specify this to have a border. And we'll give it a 3-pixel border that's solid black. Save this, refresh this page, and now I can see that on top of not just the normal tag or the class tag, ID has superseded that. Just as a general note, throughout this course, we actually won't deal with the issue of specificity too often, because we're going to be using more formatted CSS, focusing on other things, or just using Bootstrap. We won't run into this issue too often, but it's something you should be aware of in case you find yourself one day working with CSS and you're unsure why some effects aren't taking place. Maybe you're accidentally overwriting something due to its specificity. In the part5_master.css file that comes with the download for this course, you'll notice that there are 2 links, and I'm going to expand this right now and talk about them. the first link is the Mozilla Developer Network page on specificity. It talks about the concept. It actually talks about how it's calculated, where specificity is actually a weight that's applied to a given CSS declaration, and it talks a little more about it. Another one that the other link is here, it's called Design Shack, and it just talks about what the heck is CSS specificity. And I actually like this link a lot because it just talks about tags versus tags. So what wins in class versus class, what wins in ID versus class, what wins in a pseudo class versus a pseudo element, etc., and the different levels of specificity. Again, not something that we're going to be running into a whole lot throughout this course, but it is something you should be aware of. Okay, that's really all that I wanted to talk about for this lecture, just the fact that specificity exists, and probably the main ones you're going to be running into is ID superseding class, superseding a general tag call. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture where we begin explaining your assessment for this section of the course. Hello everyone, and welcome to the CSS Level 1 assessment. For this assessment, you will be given an HTML file that's actually already filled out with content. It will be your task to edit an additional CSS file to make the HTML look like the solution CSS version. So there's going to be 3 files you need to actually complete this. You're going to need to grab from the CSS Level 1 folder these 3 files right here: the Level 1 Assessment CSS, Level 1 Assessment HTML, and then the Test Solution CSS file. Let's explore the assessment and explain how these 3 files are going to work. Alright, so here I have my editor open, as well as my browser, and I've downloaded the 3 files I need: the assessment.css file, the assessment HTML file, and then the solutions.css file. So if I open up those files and take a look at first the HTML file, so CSS Level 1 Assessment.html, this is basically the HTML file that we're going to be working with CSS. So for this test, you're actually not going to be editing any HTML, but instead, you're going to be editing a CSS file that's linked to this HTML. So what we can do right now is just comment out with Control or Command / any link to the CSS, refresh this assessment test, and this is what it looks like at first. It says, "Welcome to the free blog. Thanks so much for visiting the site. What is this site for?" etc. And you see there's a link here that takes you to Google. We can expand this text area. Please log in to save your post, etc. Questions or comments, sent feedback here. All right, so we see we have a very basic HTML site. If we undo the link to the solutions.css and then refresh this, we can see that there's a ton of styling here. So we've given stuff borders, stuff background, changed the font color, changed some borders down here, etc. So this website is not meant to look better. In fact, I would say it looks worse than it did without the CSS, but it's meant for you to practice various aspects of CSS that we learned in Level 1. So what you will end up doing is once you've opened up this HTML file, you're going to change the reference apart from the solutions back to your assessment. So you'll say CSS Level 1 test or Level 1, and you will then make sure it matches the CSS file you're going to be filling out, which is CSS Level 1 assessment. Save that, refresh this, and right now it's blank. So now if we go to this file, CSS Level 1 Assessment.css, we click on it, and we notice here that we actually have a bunch of comments in it. And basically for this test, what you're going to be doing is just doing the tasks here. So for instance, it says give the body element of the site a light blue background using a hex code. So remember, just to do this first task to kind of walk you through what the assessment will be like, you'll follow along. So it says give the body element. Okay, so I know I want to grab the body and give it a light blue background. So I'll say something like background color, and if I wanted it to be dark blue, or just a normal blue, I would say something like this, blue. If I refresh this now, everything is blue. But what you'll have to do when you start this task is use a hex code to do this. So it wants to be a light blue background color using a hex code. And don't worry about any particular shade of light blue, it's really up to you. And then you have task 2, change H1 to have a 1 pixel solid black border, etc. So you can see here, you're going to be editing this CSS little by little until it essentially matches what looks like the solutions. Okay, and at the very end, there's a bonus challenge, and there's a link to Google here that will say a little hint to the challenge, but don't worry about it too much. Basically, just complete tasks 1 through 9. And in the next lecture, we're actually going to be coding through the solution. So again, you're just working with the CSS file here that's connected to the assessment. And if you ever need a refresher on what the final product essentially looks like, reconnect this HTML file to the solutions. What I don't want you to do is just immediately open this solution CSS file. Don't do that until you've given your best shot to the assessment test. All right, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.